Welcome to Chief Evangelist. I'm your host, Ethan Beute. I'm on a mission to explore and understand the role of the Chief Evangelist and the movement behind it. How should CEOs be thinking about it? How does it benefit the company? Which companies and markets need evangelism most? What does the work involve? What does success look like? And who's a good fit as a Chief Evangelist? That's what we're exploring at chiefevangelist.com and in conversations like this one. Today, we're learning from an SEO analyst and the founder of AfterYourPhD. What's the title of this podcast? He wrote his doctoral dissertation in the media school at Indiana University about evangelism. The title, Evangelism in the Tech Industry. A few parts of his process, interviewing 17 evangelists, drawing parallels to sports fandom and religious evangelism, and applying social identity theory and diffusion of innovation theory. His name, Ryan Collins. Ryan, welcome to Chief Evangelist.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it. I really appreciated you reaching out after you completed the dissertation to share it with me. I was a little bit slow on the draw in responding to that one, but really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. But where I want to start is where we always start on this podcast, which is, what is the most important job or the most important role of an evangelist?
At least from my research, I would say like education is the primary. What drives evangelism is just there's this new innovation. So evangelists need to educate people, like based on their experience that they have in the industry, talk about the innovation in a way that other people can understand outside of that space.
Love it. And so that's obviously why you wound up focusing on tech sector, I'm sure, is that's probably where the most evangelists are.
Yeah.
But before we kind of get into the specifics, how do you even define evangelism? Like when people say, like, what is the work of an evangelist? How would you respond to that based on your interviews?
I think it widely kind of differs like based on who the audience is or their place within the organization. So like their chief evangelists, their audience is going to be widely different than maybe like an advocate who might be working more closely with users. So I think mostly it depends again on the audience.
So one of the things I found really interesting about the dissertation
Mhm.
was the range of different types of evangelists. So maybe just give us a quick walk through there. Like as you were seeking evangelists, you were probably searching Twitter, LinkedIn, probably LinkedIn more than anything, and you're finding them in different seats and different roles. Break that down for folks, because I don't think people understand the breadth of applications.
Yeah, and that was something when I was doing the kind of the initial sort of research for it, and just trying to find people that maybe would fit in with the study overall, because there's a lot of evangelists from like different industries. So like there's healthcare, just general tech. There's also people in the legal space. Like it ranged a lot, and I think a lot of it is just kind of narrowing it down to because there are a lot of people. But I think I was also a little wary of. I think sometimes people can use the title. You can put it on your title on LinkedIn, and on it won't matter. But I was hoping to find someone with that title within the organization. We're paying you being an evangelist and not the other way around. So I think that was also kind of a hurdle I had to kind of get through, but that was kind of like the scope of the project.
Yeah, I've seen chief evangelist, I've seen product evangelist, I've seen like tech evangelist. I've encountered some more, and I've even interviewed some of them for this podcast already. But you also ran into folks running teams of evangelists.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like it's in certain organizations. I think there's more of a history with the role, and maybe it's more kind of mature, and that there's maybe some like clearly defined goals of what an evangelist does. Because I think that seems to be a thing where organizations don't know what evangelist is or like how to really utilize them effectively. So I think that was something I came across as well.
Are those the Microsofts and Googles and
Yeah,
Amazons of the world? Like, what are some of the other names that come to mind when you think about, like, oh, these people seem to have it together?
that's actually a good question. I didn't really think about that before
Sure.
coming into it, but yeah, I mean, any program that claims to have an evangelism program, I think they're probably on their way, but I don't know if I can answer that right off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think the assumption there that's pretty safe is if they're investing in multiple people and giving them this
Mhm.
title, they've probably got some
Yeah,
ROI tied to it, or some clarity on its purpose or function, at least.
yeah, definitely.
Um, Take me back to the beginning, like, and this will tie a little bit to what you're doing with after your PhD, perhaps at
Yeah.
some level, but like, where I want to go here for the next couple minutes is, why a PhD for you? Why the media school? And then specifically, why this dissertation topic? Like, how did you like walk me into that however you want to?
My journey is very complicated. I went into the PhD program wanting to do kind of film studies or media studies. I think it was just from like a passion growing up, like just I always like being in the theater. Like you can always talk about film, and I think I was just kind of driven by passion up to my PhD, and then during it, I sort of was kind of thinking about maybe looking at different types of disciplines, just because I think I was getting burnt out of just, like my film studies disciplines. I was kind of looking at like social science research, but I was still interested in, like, religion, and because even in film, like, I kinda like cult films and kinda like these films that people, like, have I mean, or, like, fandom in general, so I think of the tech evangelism was something that kind of drew me in, as I remember reading an article about brand evangelism, and I thought that was really interesting. Just, like, how they described it too was very, even, like, researchers would use, like, religious sort of, language and to, like, show like this relationship between like brands and consumers. And I think that's kind of what initially interested me. And then I think I was also interested in just like people's careers and kind of what they do for a living. So the idea of talking to evangelists and kind of what they do and like how they interact with different audiences and communities, I think that slowly started to make more sense as I did the dissertation. I don't know if it made sense early on, but I think once I was towards the end, it's like, this makes sense, even though my past research might not indicate that. But I think thematically it made sense. And I think it makes sense now with after PhD, just because I'm still talking to people. Like I'm still kind of knowing kind of what they do and kind of sharing what they do. I don't think job titles or job placement ad or description really tells what people do unless you really talk to them.
Yeah, that's why I'm talking to people like you and a bunch of people in the role like you did for your dissertation. I love that it was just sparked by a general interest in that religious line is interesting too. I mean, just that line of thought.
Yeah.
Talk about what you found there. I mean, obviously, it's generally popular wisdom that the idea of evangelism goes back to the Greeks and the idea of spreading the good news. Originally, the good news I think is anchored in a Christian message, but talk about that religious aspect of it.
And you just mean in terms of like how the evangelists sort of
Yeah.
perceive it or just in general?
Yeah, in general, I mean, evangelism as a broad
Yeah.
concept, and the relationship maybe between what you observed historically and religiously, and then what you observed by talking with people in the tech
Yeah.
industry.
I think the connection obviously is like in the language, but I think it sort of made a lot more sense in that relationship, just like how Guy Kawasaki, I think you've
Yep.
probably mentioned him in your podcast before. It was his books that really sparked the sort of topic for me too, because he was very like direct about this sort of relationship. Like he didn't really hide, like it's in the name. And I think sometimes when I was reading some research, like academic research, they didn't want to make that connection super clear. But when I read his work, it was pretty clear. Like that's where he kind of got the sort of this concept of evangelism. But I mean, it comes from like Christian evangelism, where it's like they would go anywhere and everywhere to spread the good news or spread this new thing that people don't really know about. And at the time, it was like Christianity because no one really knew what it was. So you have to tell everybody about it. When I say tech or innovation, it can kind of extend outside of just like iPhones or computers. Like it can be something like maybe like a water purifier that people don't know about, or just like this new idea that spreads and that people are really excited about it and kind of want to tell people about it and educate them about it. I guess that's also like that tie to religion and Christianity because there is like this educational component too. It's like this complex thing. Like tech is complex, but like religion is also complex. So it's like people have to teach other people about it to really understand it in a way that they can really like comprehend it.
Yeah, one of the most interesting sources that you drew on was an article. I think the magazine is called, or the website is called Risen. I
Yeah.
didn't realize that Guy Kawasaki was of the Christian faith, honestly,
Yeah.
even though he wears it on his sleeve. That was a really fun interview to read, and I really enjoyed reading a lot of the work that you cited.
Mhm.
Would you say, I mean, in terms of tracking the history back of tech evangelism, I think most people would go to Guy Kawasaki in general. I think that's the
Mhm.
most familiar name and the first, notable instance was his chief evangelist role at Apple. But did you find like how far back did you find this? I guess to use a more generic term, secular evangelism. You know,
Yeah.
did you find anything older or prior to Guy Kawasaki's work?
I didn't, and it seemed like the term evangelist, like, wasn't really a thing before the '80s, but now that I think about it, that is something that when I'm kind of look back at individuals, maybe I'm thinking kind of like the Edisons of the world or like the Teslas of the world, like these people that are very much customer facing almost, like they're the face of the like this innovation. So like you could think of like people like Edison, I think is an evangelist because it one hand they're also like businessmen, but they're also like business people, but they're like evangelizing this new thing that people don't know. At the time, it was like electricity, or was it Tesla? Was it DC or AC? I forgot which one.
I don't remember. I
I
just
can't
know
remember
that
the
there
top
was
of
a
my head.
battle that was like VHS and Beta,
Yeah,
and
even that.
and
Yeah, I'm sure
arguably the
they're.
wrong one. I think.
Yeah, well, and I guess that kind of also tied to my master's thesis, was of like VHS, like these communities that are really like passionate about like a new, well, in this case, like an old technology, but it's like the inverse, I guess, of like evangelism. I feel like that would be a whole other topic of just how people use the label, even because I'm sure like there might have been, or they might have still used it in a religious sense, like they thought of electricity as like a work of God or something. I think it's just how maybe if they framed it in a certain way, because I don't know if the secularism was as big of a thing in that time though, I guess.
Um, how about this idea of a human doing this work? Like, did that factor into anything you're doing? Like, because there are obviously a
Mhm.
lot of different ways to educate, especially, as we move past the 80s and 90s. We have mainstream internet access for the most part. There are a lot of different ways to connect with and educate people. Did you encounter or develop any of your own thoughts about a human doing this work? I have some of my own, and I think it's
Yeah.
interesting. Um, but I'd love to know any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the draw to evangelists is like a lot of evangelists have a lot of experience in the industry, and I think they already have some credibility from the audience that people might already know who the name is or recognize that they know what they're talking about. Or either expertise or just maybe just who they are, and maybe they just wanna hear their story, because it seemed like a lot of the cheap evangelists and a lot of the evangelists that are really just kinda speaking at conferences or, like, these large events, like, people are going to hear them, like, as a person, not just, like, the evangelist that's what they're going towards or wanna attend for, so I think the human component is still really interesting, because at least it seemed like large organizations, if they're hiring evangelists, it was also because of their name, like, it wasn't just because they thought they were the best at what they do, but maybe it's also that they're recognizable in their space, so they have some sort of authority and credibility. I think the human component is really important just because that story element and just who they are.
Yeah, I like the blend of trust and credibility and authority.
Mhm.
And it is interesting to observe. I should maybe run that down myself as how many people found themselves in the role because of expertise versus how many people were appointed to the role for their authority and credibility
Yeah.
that perhaps had already been developed. And that's an interesting thing. We haven't gotten into that yet on this podcast. I think this will be episode 14, 15, 16, somewhere in there.
Mhm.
And we haven't really gotten into like what's next. Can evangelists get hired into another evangelist role? Did you
Mhm.
by chance encounter anyone who had been an evangelist in multiple different organizations? Because I have not personally.
That's a good question. I know that there were a lot of advocates, so it's kind of like people that were it's like they just left the boot camp and then they were really passionate about that boot camp because it helped them get a job, and they also want to kind of show other people about like the good news about boot camps, that you can make a new, like you can have a career out of a boot camp education. But they ended up in different types of roles. It seems like with evangelism, it's like it's kind of people whose careers, it's like past senior almost. It's like they've already kind of demonstrated that they know the space and industry very well. So I don't think it's like the end of the line, but
So, and oftentimes words like, and this could kind of go to the human piece of the conversation too. A lot of the words that come up here are like passion
mhm,
and like fervor. There's
yeah,
kind of an emotional component or the transfer of emotion, which you can characterize sales as the transfer of emotion, for example.
definitely.
Um, talk about anything you found like relative to like again sports fandom or you even drew on televangelism, which I thought
Yeah.
was pretty interesting. The idea of televised Christian evangelism. Talk about that kind of like love, loyalty, emotion, fervor, zealotry aspect of any of this stuff. Like how does that factor in? Why is it so important?
That's when I was kind of doing the research. I mean, and I really do wish looking back, that I could have extended a little bit more to really understand like the cyclical sort of relationship, maybe with like brands and evangelists, and like because a lot of times these evangelists are like behind sort of brands that are already established, or there could be cases where it's like the brand is fairly new and they want to get people excited about this new thing. But it seemed like, at least now, it seems like there's a lot of tech itself isn't really new, but it's like this new brand that people are also promoting. Cause like when I did the case study, like boot camps they've been a thing for a number of years, but is this specific boot camp that they were trying to kind of promote. So I think it really kind of depends, because if you're like an evangelist at a company like Google or Microsoft, like there's already a lot of like fervor or like passion around the tech anyways. So I think it's a lot of it is strategy and understanding like who your audience is.
So diffusion of innovation.
Yes.
I think most people would popularly know this as, the curve with early adopters,
Mhm.
early majority, late majority, and then the laggards who, gosh, they're just super,
Yeah.
super late to the party. Um, talk about, explain for anyone who's not familiar, better than I just did, diffusion of innovation and how this fits into the conversation, how it fit into your dissertation.
Innovation isn't necessarily like technical. It can be like an idea, or it can be something maybe more abstract, like just religion in general. I think it's considered like an innovation if a group hasn't heard about it. I think of diffusion of innovation, like this sort of process of how society understands something new, how it goes from this small group of people that are kind of learning about it and then get more passionate about it, and then it kind of spreads to a new sort of audience and kind of grows from there. But I just think of it as like the process of how new ideas spread from maybe some like small beginnings to like a larger audience.
Cool. Social identity theory. I'm not as familiar with that one. I did, of course, encounter it in the dissertation. Share a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think part of it was trying to understand from like a consumer sort of perspective, or like even as I was kind of exploring more, just this notion of that people's identity is wrapped within an evangelist label. I think a lot of times we think we are based on our job titles, or we maybe take that more than we should or something. Like I'm an SEO analyst, but I'm not an SEO analyst. I happen to be one. Like it's that sort of relationship, but yeah, I try to look more at, like, the relationship from brands and individuals, but I think it turned more in the end where I was looking at, like, how these evangelists make sense of their identity and, like, who they are based on their job title as well. Because a lot of these evangelists are kind of pulling from their personal background to kind of talk about where they are in their job and, like, how they got there, or, like, people that come from humble beginnings, like, how they ended up in their role, and, like, maybe how the technology personally changed their life too is something else, like, or how that brand might have changed their life. So, yeah, I think a lot of it's just how they understand themselves in relation to their job title. That's kind of how it ended up.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about because you have the individual,
Mhm.
you have the actual product or service,
Yeah.
you have the brand kind of over top of both. And then you have this what I've had a lot of conversations around is this bigger idea of, I'm evangelizing the problem or the
Mhm.
shift or the different perspective or the change in our lifestyles more than I'm evangelizing the brand or the product or the service. And so there's just
Yeah.
multiple layers there. And it is interesting now that you've laid it out for me that way to think about how different people embody the role relative to the problem, relative to the
Mhm.
brand, and relative to the specific product or service.
Yeah, definitely. There was an evangelist who he's really interested in like educational technology, and like he kind of drew upon his background like growing up in like an underserved community, and like how the tech that they were using was very transformative in his life, and how like he wanted to kind of help others. So I think a lot of it was like this tech was something he's very passionate about because it's very personally like fulfilling, or very personally like he could really talk about it passionately. But at the same time, as again I mentioned before, like organizations kind of see that story though, and they kind of also like they know that people want to hear that story. So it's maybe not just about the tech, but it's kind of like both. But yeah, so it's either like they're trying to the tech solves a problem, or maybe it's personally fulfilling in some way. But
Yeah, that was a good one. I actually know that gentleman. I had him hosted him on my other podcast, the Customer Experience podcast years ago. And it's a really that's a great example, by the way, this idea that the story and the passion and the sincerity and all these other things we can all connect with
Mhm.
elevates this from being just a commercial brand or a, $245 Chromebook to
Yeah.
being, a liberating or democratizing or, similar kind of, it elevates it. Like the human experience,
Mhm.
like applied, elevates the whole conversation.
Definitely. Technology is really like complicated, or just looking at the source code for anything, or like looking at documentation for anything can be really like what's going on, or like what is the applications of this new technology, and like what can it mean in my life, or like personally in my life. Like I think the evangelist kind of ties the abstract with the technical maybe, and tries to makes it more like how the tech solves a problem, but like how it solves a problem in your life, which might be more like a different level, I guess.
Yeah, I like that. And it not only makes it more useful, it makes it easier to
Meaningful.
tell other people as well. Like
Definitely.
the more you can suggest or imply or even drive me to experience that transformation in my own life, the easier it is for me to evangelize it to other people as someone who
Mhm.
is now in the fold, so to speak. Um, so one of the reasons I started this podcast is that series I did several years ago, almost 4 years ago now, um, still ranks like second or third organically for the search chief evangelist. And so I've had a number of these conversations over the years, and that it is just a reminder of how little is actually published on this topic. Like, talk about that from your perspective, maybe from a couple different perspectives. One, did you observe similar right away? Two, in terms of your advisors on the dissertation, did any of them have concerns about the lack of well established norms around this, or was that an exciting factor? And then, perhaps after we get through that, we can maybe go into, some of the, materials that you did find and draw upon besides the interviews.
Yeah, so that's a good question, because I'm very interested in it's kind of tough when it comes to academia. Maybe that's why I kind of left, but I'm very curious about different things, a wide array of things. So evangelism in this specific topic was very interdisciplinary. So it did pull from like communications, religion, like social science, like maybe like sociology. So my advisors, I think they were pretty open about it, just because I think the topic itself was something they didn't really encounter before. Like I had a person on my committee who she was in religious studies department. So like she had a different perspective than my media school faculty, which is kind of what I was hoping for, is like this different perspective on, because I think that's just kind of what interests me. Like, but that also makes it kind of troublesome when you're trying to do the research, because there weren't like several books on tech evangelism, or like there wasn't there weren't like it was difficult to kind of find like an established like scholar on tech evangelism, or but it is maybe if you when I kind of look more at like diffusion innovation, there was more there. Like there's like more of established sort of literature in diffusion of innovation, but just in terms of like individuals in this role, I couldn't really find as many sources as I wanted to. A lot of it I was kind of having to look at like kind of Google Books, some like other journals I could find. A lot of them were about like blah, brand evangelism, which I cited a number of times. Can't think off the top of my head, since it's been about a year since I've kind of taken a look at it again. Yeah, that was definitely a problem, but again, Guy Kawasaki was a great influence, looking at his work, as kind of like a good really good starting point, seeing, like, who he cited, but also any sort of academic journals I could find, so it wasn't so I had some sort of academic rigor associated with the project. Yeah, it was a struggle, but the more I went into the topic, it seemed like there was something new I didn't really think about before, or like some new source I didn't find before. So, I mean, and that's why I like research. And even though I left academia, like I still have this passion for just learning new things, whatever they are.
Awesome. You kind of drew a little bit of a line at brand evangelism. Talk. It's a subtle difference, but talk about that subtle difference from your perspective.
Yeah. So the dissertation itself is primarily about tech evangelism. So it's primarily about like the actual innovation itself. So when I talk about it, it's when it's like a computer, like it's a computer. Like we all know that it's very innovative in itself. Like if you talk to someone like 100 years ago, like they would be amazed like at what we're using right now to have this call on. But I think when I talk about brand evangelism, or it's how it's talked about in the research, it's more about this more abstract sort of thing. Like it's not just a computer, it's an Apple computer. So there's something more meaningful maybe, or something more about it. Or like I remember reading another study about like Jeep evangelism, like the brand Jeep. Like people are very like there's a lot of 4x4 vehicles, but like Jeep, like there's like a community around it. Maybe not just around this like 4x4 car, but just the brand itself, and like who people identify as. Like I'm a Jeep person, or like I only drive Jeep. But if you say you're a Land Rover person, that might signify something else. Or so yeah, I think it's just a lot of this sort of passion around like these abstract symbols in tech that can vary. Like because I talked to people that were the brand, it was fairly newer startup, so people might not know it. But there's also brands that are like big that everyone knows. So I think they're tied in different ways in terms of evangelism. But brand evangelism, it feels more like abstract, like because innovation has like this sort of already, people are maybe aware of it beforehand. So if that makes sense. But
Yeah, it does. It's really, really interesting. I think of it as
Mhm.
kind of, the cult of brand. And the interesting thing is that Guy Kawasaki straddles both of those lines.
Yeah.
Like it was this idea of, a new way to interact with your computer, a new way to be productive and
Mhm.
creative. At the same time, it's all done under the Apple brand. And if any company has built a cult, Jeep is a great example.
Yeah.
That one also made me think of Harley Davidson,
Yeah, Harley Davidson.
kind of the cult and the community around that. And then it's interesting to think about which ones have emerged more organically and which ones were stoked with specific activities. I think every company wants it. Nobody quite knows how to get it. And so it's like you and I could probably theorize for the next 10 minutes about how much of it is organic and how much of it can be, created or manipulated. But I don't know how productive that would be. So in reflection now, he already said it's a year removed from being published,
Yeah.
over that by the time we release this. But when you think about the types of companies and markets that are out there, the types of companies and markets that, we already talked about some that have multiple evangelists and have had them
Mhm.
for years. But what would you say to someone who is, in a young company in an innovative space? Like, who needs evangelism or why? Or like, how would you advise or encourage someone to consider making this a formal function? Like, what's going on in their business or what's going on in the market, or what are some of the characteristics where you'd say, hey, you should really take a look at this and consider it?
I would say if it would really depend on the tech itself. Do you really find it like revolutionary or something that can change the world? Because if you do have the feeling that this new tech, or like this, maybe it's a new app, who knows? Like if you really think it can change something, like I would say having an evangelist is a good thing, because there's going to be a lot of educating that's going to be needed. There's going to be a lot of questions. There's going to be a lot of pushback. Because I was kind of thinking this, I don't know if it's a tangent, but I was kind of thinking to like how crypto, like, I don't know if they need more evangelists, or maybe are there too many? I'm not really sure. Because at least I have a lot of feelings about crypto and all that stuff. But because I feel like they were evangelizing something that people didn't see the benefit in, like NFT. Like, because I remember like just recently, like I think I swear I saw like NFT evangelists or something. I'm like, do they need evangelists? Like, because the tech is new, but I don't know if it was changing the world in a way that, like, in a positive way.
Yeah,
Excited.
I have a couple thoughts there. One, I think it needed a rebrand. I think crypto
Yeah.
comes with a lot of like baggage. It sounds dark and
Yeah.
mysterious. It also has kind of like that crypto bro vibe. I don't know if that came before or
Yeah.
after, but it's interesting because I would think that that both crypto and NFT would benefit from it, but it needs like what's
Yeah.
missing is that credibility and authority. I think
Mhm.
there are a lot of people evangelizing it, but I don't know that any of them have the trust and credibility and authority to develop. I mean, they do in a subcultural capacity, but not in this kind of going to your diffusion of innovation. Um, and I think probably the best source there is Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Like, um, neither really broke into mainstream because you couldn't describe it to your parents, for
Exactly. Yeah.
example. Like, why is this meaningful or beneficial? And why is it, so volatile in terms of its value and some of these other things? I think there's a lot that needs to be told there, but I
Mhm.
don't know that there's a source that anyone can trust around it,
Yeah.
especially not with the FTX implosion that's still pretty fresh as we're recording this.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, because maybe, like, 10 years from now, it'd make more sense to, like, have these people that are very mature in the industry and kind of know to have, like, a good perspective of, like, the history, I think also is important, like, to have some sort of way to tell the story of the innovation or just how they kinda saw it through the years, but, yeah, I know when I saw, like, the term, like, because I have seen, like, crypto evangelists, I know for sure that's a thing on LinkedIn, but, yeah, I don't know, it makes sense in some other areas, like, but it just crypto to me, I'm just very skeptical about. But again, I think that is that again, my mind's very wanders in different ways of like there could be another study about this too, like just how people perceive the label or just like would you want to do business with someone that has an evangelist in their title compared to just a sales person or something. So
Yeah.
yeah.
The
But
I like the reference to the historian and the historical arc of a
yeah.
technology and how it's emerged. We actually talked about
Mhm.
that quite a bit when I hosted Daniel Jester, who is essentially he was a photographer and ran studios for like e-commerce, like
Mhm.
all those beautiful product images we see on websites. Someone needs to make them, and so he was very steeped in that and was involved in that from really its high growth period. And in our conversation, he drew this like really clear historical story arc that allowed us to be where we are today. And then for people who weren't participating in the technology or the transformation that he's evangelizing, he was able to like walk them into why they are where they are. That helps people understand where they
Mhm.
are. Oh, okay. I just didn't make this last two set of steps or something. That history piece is really important. Um, Anything you would advise, I asked you about, companies, markets, leaders. Any observations for someone who is starting to do this work or aspires to do the work?
I think the role of evangelists is to make things not complex, and their goal is really to help people understand something in a new way, or like, but again, just be very passionate about it. But I think it's also important to think about maybe like I know we talked. I think our ROI was mentioned earlier, but I think when it comes like in the organization itself, like really showing like what your impact is, and like having some sort of stats maybe or something like because even though like evangelism is kind of abstract, like there needs to be some like concrete way to show that your evangelism is working. Because if you're just evangelizing, but no one seems to care, then maybe you have to like rethink what you're doing. Maybe like even tech itself. But yeah, I think that was a kind of frustration I saw from evangelists. Like there wasn't, they might have not got the buy-in that they wanted from organizations, or that people maybe like didn't see the value as much, or they had really had to like go out of the way to show what the value was. Um, but yeah, I think that's always kind of difficult. Like, because if you go to a conference and then you hope people respond positively, like, how do you really measure that? If you speak at a conference, like, I guess they could maybe do signups or something else, but it's a little bit harder than just like an ad online where you can really see the engagement or something. So, but yeah, I think big thing is just communication is like super important, but also buy-in from the organization and like some sort of concrete sort of ways to show how well you're evangelizing is, I think, important.
Yeah, and that is definitely a struggle, and we talk about it almost every episode,
Yeah.
how challenging that can be. The thing that you triggered for me there in the way that you expressed that was the idea that, it's obviously important for the organization in order to permit the work or the function or the role to exist, or perhaps even to invest in it and build a team of evangelists, but also for
Mhm.
individuals. There are a lot of different personality types
Yeah.
that really thrive on, I need to know that I'm winning and I need to know how I'm winning. And so I don't just need this for, the company and to justify my role and my salary or
Mhm.
however I'm being compensated. I also need it for myself. I'm not of that type. Like I'm fine like operating in a great deal of ambiguity and like, am I winning? I don't know. It feels like I'm winning,
Mhm.
but. Um But it's a definitely a constant issue. So one of the ways that I typically conclude these conversations is by asking if there's something that you find yourself evangelizing in your own personal life. And if you're thinking of something fun, we could go to that, like,
Like,
but what I would love to hear from you is, after your PhD,
yeah,
it's something that you started. It's I think a blog, a LinkedIn page. Talk about what you're
yeah.
doing there and the types of folks that you've drawn into that conversation.
Yeah, weirdly enough, I told myself, like, I think I was, like, burnout from my dissertation. I was like, "I don't think I'm gonna do much, like, content creation or writing." It's like, I'll take a break from it, but something about this idea of, like, helping people sort of navigate from, academia to, like, industry, kind of where I'm at right now, just I felt like something that to needed to be, and I've kind of seen other sort of things before, but they're more like services or, like, consultation services or some, like, or career coaching, which I think it works for some people, but I just wanted to have, like, this free resource of really just, like, interviews and other sort of topics I could muster, but I just what helped me in my sort of transition was just talking to people and just interviewing people, and that was something I was kinda doing in my dissertation. I was like, maybe I am good at talking to people and kind of letting them talk about who they are and what they do. Because I think over time, I've learned that people like to talk about themselves, and it was really surprisingly easy with evangelists because I think they wanna talk, like, they wanna talk about what they do and what they're passionate about, so it was really sort of easy to let that happen. And I think a lot of PhDs are willing to, like, talk about their experience too, because I would imagine most PhDs had some sort of stress or anxiety in their life, where just like they just don't know where they're gonna go or like what they want to do. If the academic job market's so tough and competitive, they just want to help other people. And anytime I'm on LinkedIn and I reach out, like usually people respond, like they want to talk about their stories. So I think after PhD, hopefully it kind of fills this gap where I interview them and they can share their story, but also like share it to as many people as they can. So, because I know a number of PhDs who they're just kind of busy anyways, even after leaving and at their own jobs and their own life, but people still want to pick their brains, I guess, or kind of understand like how they got to where they are at that point. So, I think the site ideally is I can use it to help them kind of share their story too with other people, and they can kind of share a link. Maybe instead of having to do like several calls that are really difficult. I mean, not really difficult, but really difficult to fit in their schedule because there's a ton right now. They're kind of moving to UX or data science and these kind of more popular sort of sectors. But yeah, and I guess that's right now maybe what I'm passionate about evangelizing. Maybe not necessarily. Like I know the academic system has a lot of problems, and I try not to be as critical of that just because there are people in that system, and some are successful, and you can't really like I don't wanna knock them down and, like, that's their own path, but to me, I'm just kind of evangelizing, like, the ability to just ask questions and the ability to, like, talk to people and just kind of know that there are other paths outside of academia and that you can still have a fulfilling life, and you're more than, like, your job title. You're more than a researcher, like, or evangelism, like, how, like, people are very attached to, like, their title, but I think academia, like, we that happens too, like, or just the doctor label, like, it's kinda hard to see yourself outside of the system. So helping people see that you can be more than that, or you can have your own identity outside of that, I think is what I'm evangelizing.
I love it. I really appreciate your approach to it, and it's such a healthy development for you personally, and I like the
Yeah.
way that it applies to other people as well. For folks who've enjoyed our time here, where would you send them to follow up, to maybe connect with you on LinkedIn, or to check out even after your PhD?
Yeah, so I'm gonna I actually do have another interview scheduled for after PhD. I'm talking to, like, a he works in the legal field, and, he's a lawyer, so we were gonna talk about transitioning from, careers in legal to, like, industry, so, uh, I'm gonna be talking to him, but yeah, I would check out afteryourphd.com, of course, because I'm hoping to kind of revamp it a little bit, add some more interviews, maybe try to add some more articles I can find, but yeah, the site's good. Usually on LinkedIn, happy to really connect with anybody on LinkedIn. I'm sure you can share in the comments. I think my email is on the site. Your PhD@gmail.com is good too. Oh yeah, I'm happy to just talk to people, not just like a consulting basis, but just if they just want to ask questions, I'm free to answer those. But if anyone wants to like also be interviewed for the site, I'm down.
I'll link that stuff up. We do that everywhere that we publish the episodes, which we do, of course, at all the podcast players. We do it on
Mhm.
YouTube. We do it at chiefevangelist.com. He is Ryan Collins, so I'll link up all the things he mentioned there. I am Ethan Beute. I also am down to talk to people. I talk to people all the time about evangelism. I talk to people about podcasting. I talk to people about books.
Mhm.
And I really appreciate your approach, Ryan. I appreciate you taking on this topic. And I'm really glad you reached out on it because I've learned a lot from you. That wraps up this episode of Chief Evangelist. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to Ringmaster Conversational Marketing for helping bring these episodes to you. With any thoughts or questions about the Chief Evangelist role, message me on LinkedIn. I'm Ethan Beute, ETHAN BEUTE. For show notes and more of these conversations, visit chiefevangelist.com.